Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Botany Bistro. My name's Mary, and I'm so happy to be with you today, and I'm joined by my coworker, Sam. I'll introduce him properly in just a moment, but I wanted to just reach out and say that I'm so glad we have some folks on with us today. We're coming at you live from the Civic Garden Center. This is the 25th. Whoa.
Wow.
25th episode of the Bistro. And today we're talking about plant ecology. We're continuing our conversation from a couple of weeks ago. And also, it's a little bittersweet because this is the last Bistro that I had on the schedule. We've done these for a whole year. And I started out doing this because I felt like I just wanted to share the botanical knowledge that I have with everyone. And the Civic Garden Center really makes it a part of their mission to be able to share community-based building activities and conservation and urban agriculture education with our local community, regional community, and through the internet, the whole world. So that's what the Bistro is all about, just taking bite-sized botany pieces and kind of breaking them down. We have discussed biotechnology, plant systematics and taxonomy, physiology, plant pathology. We talked about morphology, anatomy, paleobotany, plant breeding and genetics, and physiology. So if you feel like you need to get caught up, we do have an archive on our website, and all of those videos are posted, and this one will be up shortly after we have our session today. But yeah, it's just been a really, really fun ride. So I just wanted to say so much gratitude for everyone who's helped out, all of our guests, all of the people working behind the scenes, and definitely all of the people tuning in. So thank you so much. Every week we have some lunch. I hope you're all enjoying lunch. Today, I made some lunch for Sam and I. It smells really good. Well, we were talking about beans at our staff meeting yesterday. And so I was like, well, I got to do something with beans. So change it up a little bit. It's a beef shank stew. But yes, I can't wait to have it. Too hot? Okay.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. Thank
You're welcome. And so hopefully you're all having something yummy today. It is lunch hour after all. And thinking about our topic today, we're talking about ecology. Ecology is about relationships and interactions. And so I thought a stew just kind of fit that perfectly because we're putting lots of things in together and they're all working together in concert. We always have a little bit of homework for the Bistro, and so our topic for today is really going to be focusing on conservation. And I would love to hear about your conservation goals, if it's your own personal property or if it's a public space, if it's something that you are just interested in and maybe don't have a lot of experience with. Please tag us on social media, share this with us at Civic Garden. We would love to hear from you. Also, I would usually tell you when the next Bistro is before we get started, but we're going to take a little hiatus, and I've got some traveling this summer. I've probably launched back up right around my birthday in October, and so if you're on our little interest list, you'll get some info about that. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sam Sedemeyer. Sam and I have been working together at the Civic Garden Center for the past 2 years. Sam has taught me so much about conservation and the kind of just big picture aspect of what we're looking at when we look at a landscape. When I worked at Civic Garden Center before, in my previous roles, I was very focused on school gardens and kind of the ecosystem of the school and how the students and the teachers are interacting with these garden spaces. And then I came back to Civic Garden Center after a 5-year teaching stint at Gamble Montessori High School. And when I came back, I learned about the Walnut Woods project that you were doing. And it took me a while to wrap my head around this project because it wasn't something I was familiar with. It's a long-term restoration project. So basically these woods were filled with invasive species, which we'll talk about today. And the process of removing those invasive species, reintroducing native plant species that can provide the ecological habitat that is desired there, and then using that space as a learning lab. So it really took this kind of raised bed garden concept that I was used to installing at schools to a whole other level of, well, let's think 5 years out, let's think 10 years out. And I was like, what? And just impressed immensely by the work that has been done on that project. And it has been a team of people doing that work, and the students have been so instrumental too. So hoping to share some of that with you today. What else should I say about you for everybody?
Yeah, I'm our conservation program manager, so that's my title here at the Civic Garden Center. Really that does encompass, as Mary said, working with invasive plants and working to restore some habitats. We'll talk a little bit about how we kind of approach that in a little bit. But then also we really try to focus on, those native plants that are going to go back into those habitats once the bad plants are gone. So we also, grow plants from seed here, everything from herbaceous perennials that are really for the pollinators to our woody plants that are really, focused on just a much bigger array of species. So we try to really encompass the whole gambit here at the Civic Garden Center. We try to make sure we're thinking through and providing the resources and the education to people to be successful from start to finish, and not just get you started and send you off and, struggle with the invasive species, kind of problem, because it can get really overwhelming and really difficult really quickly. So I think the last kind of key component for us at the Civic Garden Center is that sense of community that we, really instill in everything we do. When you're getting frustrated with not being able to successfully remove a couple species, it's at least nice to have somebody else to relate with, somebody else who's had similar experiences. Maybe they've had some better success with that plant. So we really want to make sure we can give people a community to come and, if nothing else, vent to, but hopefully learn from as well.
It's always good to have a friend to vent to.
Yeah, you need that. You need that.
So what we're going to talk about today is the concept of restoring an area. So we live and work in an urban environment. And so when we think about natural spaces in this environment, you have to be creative, right? And so we're thinking about what was here before the concrete, what was here before all of the streets and the buildings, and how does that impact the way that we want to move forward. So when I was younger and I was walking around the woods, I often thought, oh, this has always been here. It's always going to be here. And it's kind of this static place that I visit. As I got older, I understood that on my grandfather's farm, for example, he was logging. And so the new tree species that were coming up from these areas of light that were opened up when you took out the older species, that was something that he was actively managing. That wasn't something that was just happening. And then I started to understand a little bit more about how he was using native plants around his farm to attract more pollinators to his different areas. So he was doing a lot of things that it took me a while to kind of understand those concepts. And so something I've heard you say, Sam, is that what we're talking about is actually restoration conservation. And that's kind of a mouthful, so we didn't put that in Sam's job title. But can you tell us a little bit about that particular piece? What is restoration conservation?
Yeah, so restoration conservation is really that focus of trying to restore a habitat to, as Mary said, kind of its maybe historical vigor and biodiversity that was represented there. And I think there's some things that we can talk about as to why that's really difficult to do nowadays. But really, you're trying to reestablish the species that should have been there throughout time, and by having the plants that are native to that area, and establishing healthy biodiverse habitats, we've really seen through all kinds of conservation activities that when you build the habitats, the animals and the insects that were meant to be there just come back. Whether you're in a hyper-urban area, whether you're in a suburban or rural area, the species seem to find their way back once the habitat's there. So if you can really get the plant families that are the basis, the food, the resources that those animals need, they often find their way back to where they kind of want to be. So that's really what we're focusing on, is that restoration process of taking out the plants that have invaded. We talked a little bit about invasive plants, and so oftentimes our primary focus is on removing the non-native invasive plants that have established themselves. So these are plants that were introduced from other parts of the world, oftentimes through the horticultural trade or through, agricultural uses, in which we said this plant will really help us manage erosion on the side of our farm fields, or this plant is really beautiful, so we want to see it in our gardens. And those plants, especially the plants that have become invasive, are oftentimes from areas of the world that have a similar climate as we do. So if you look latitude-wise across the earth, we oftentimes hear that a lot of our invasive plants are from parts of China or Northern Europe, and that's because they have pretty similar climates to our area here in Southwest Ohio and the eastern United States. So those plants are able to come here, do really well, but do so well that they actually can naturally reproduce and produce seeds on their own. And then as they start to escape into natural areas, since they don't have their predators or the other fungal diseases, things like that help keep them in check and keep the populations down, they oftentimes are able to really explode quickly and take over areas much more rapidly than our native plants can. And in the process, they actually displace our native plants. So you can, if you're in here in Southwest Ohio, honeysuckle is the one that everybody generally knows. And so honeysuckle is a woody shrub. It grows really fast. It really is tough. It can tolerate sun, shade, wet, dry. It can tolerate anything. And so this plant has taken over a lot of our forests, and in the process displaced a lot of the native vegetation that should be there. And so instead you end up with a monoculture in the forest. So just a whole forest of one or, a very few number of species. And when the birds and the things show up to look for their food, it's absent. It's just this honeysuckle left behind. And maybe they can visit the flowers for their couple weeks that they're flowering, or eat a couple of the berries in the fall. But it's a very limited food source compared to the amount of diversity they're expecting. So our restoration conservation focus is on removing those invasive plants and hopefully reestablishing the native plants. And then from there, we just let the wildlife and the insects find their way back on their own.
Nice. That's really the ecology component that I am seeing happen even here on our grounds. So we have 8 acres here. If you're local to Cincinnati, please come visit us. We're in Avondale. And I have a lot of student groups that come in. So we have a lot of field trips, and the students are always very interested to hear about what animals we have. What animals do you have? And I tell them we have lots of animals. We don't have animals in cages. Although I guess we do keep a vermicompost bin, so I don't know. But we have animals here because of the species that we are nurturing here. And the focus on biodiversity and the planting of native plants, I really think has boosted all of the different critters that I see. Obviously the squirrels and the birds are, they kind of make themselves known, but also just the soil health and the microorganisms in the soil and how healthy the plants look, especially after some rains. We're having some rainy days right now, and so I see that vitality, I guess is the word I want to use, and the beauty of having all these different species intermingled. We've talked about the dangers of monocrops on this show before, and so thinking about looking at a garden and seeing lots of different things, and sometimes that also means you're seeing bite marks on your leaves, and you're maybe leaving your leaf litter and your stems so that you're fostering that habitat. So rethinking, reframing that idea. And so that brings me to my next question for you, is like, why does it matter? I mean, you talked a little bit about why we want to do this. We're plant people, right? And so we find the beauty in lots of different places. But long term, what are we really doing this for? What's the work for?
Yeah, I think this is one of those acts that the work itself is happening on a local level. We're doing this in Cincinnati Park properties throughout the Cincinnati region. We're encouraging homeowners in the region to be doing this. So it's really, the work itself is very local, but the reasons that we're doing this are very global and very much beyond just the confines of Cincinnati. And a lot of them have to do with the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. There's so many species that are starting to go extinct that were really strong and prevalent in North America, and through our land use changes and some of the other kind of changes that we've made to the ecosystems here, those populations of insects are declining, and as the insects disappear, they're the next step on the food chain up from the plants, and so then other wildlife are being impacted. So especially bird species, for example, are being really negatively impacted. And we're seeing huge decline in bird populations. And those are indicators that are telling us that there is something really out of whack here, that there's something going wrong, that if we don't start to act now, we could wake up one day and say, oh my gosh, we've just lost huge portions of these species and maybe to the point of extinction. And so we really need to act now to be able to start to preserve some of the biodiversity that is quickly disappearing throughout parts of North America and really around the world, as we have different acts of industrial agriculture, the process of urbanization. When we build out our cities, we're doing a lot to take up land for human uses, and we do a pretty bad job at carving out spots for our animals and our other wildlife in that process. There's definitely some countries around the world that are doing a better job than we are here in the United States, but generally speaking, as we see more and more people, populations continue to expand on the planet, there's less room for these other creatures that have lived here. And as the number of species dwindles, habitats become much more fragile, and especially in the face of climate change, we are seeing changes that are pretty scary. And so a lot of this work has to do with preserving the biodiversity on a local level so that within the global perspective, we still have biodiversity within these different regions, so that as the climate changes, there's enough species to kind of bounce back and give us a fighting chance at making sure that things can continue healthy and happy into the future. I think we've learned a lot in the last several decades, even throughout this process of industrialization. I think we, at least in this country for a while, were really focused on getting as big as possible as quickly as possible, and so we maybe didn't think so much about the other impacts that we were having on other wildlife. I think fortunately now, through the native plant movement, through other large-scale conservation efforts, within national parks, within other landowning entities. I know we have Cardinal Land Conservancy here in the Southwest Ohio region that's buying up land that would be habitat that could be turned into a farm, for example, and trying to make sure it stays as habitat for wildlife. So really, I think this is a local act, day to day. We're out in the backyard and we're removing the honeysuckle. We're probably not thinking about the big global impact, but the reason we're doing this is for that global perspective of biodiversity, and making sure that we're helping in that fight to preserve as many species as we can.
Yeah, I sometimes forget, even about how we get things, right? So this might be a little bit long-winded, but my husband was saying something the other day, and I listened to him, actually. I remember what you said, honey. And so we were talking with our children who are very into Minecraft right now, right? So if you don't know, it's this game on the computer where you, place blocks. I don't know. It's creative. That's about as much as I know about it. But it involves mining. And so they, take their little pickaxe in the game and they, collect ore or whatever they do. And my husband made the, observation that was our cell phones were made out of things people dug out of the ground. I mean, it's just wait, what? Mind blown. You're not going to find a cell phone on a tree or whatever, but these are materials. The materials that we eat, the materials we wear, the materials we build our homes out of, the medicines that we take, all of those things come from nature. We're so far removed sometimes with our air conditioning and our Vespas. I don't even know what people are into, but these are all things that people dug out of the earth, collected from nature. And so just reminding ourselves that this biodiversity that we're losing, we don't even really know what we're losing yet, because we haven't tapped into the vast array of possibilities for a lot of these species. And so just that act of wanting to preserve what we still have, that really echoes something that we talked about a few weeks ago during biotechnology when I had Megan on from Crew, and talking about, well, we're just going to save stuff. We don't really know what we're going to use it for yet, but if we lose it, we have no idea what we've lost. And so I think that concept of understanding that we're not separate from nature, that we're part of it, and when you walk through the woods, you can probably see human impact beyond the trail you're actually walking on. I'm seeing a lot more tree cages around new plantings. I'm seeing cut stumps of honeysuckle that have been dabbed with a blue, herbicide, I guess.
Yep.
And so I'm seeing this human impact and realizing that these are not static spaces. These are not spaces that are just going to continue to exist on their own. We have a responsibility to work to preserve them. And so I want to kind of zoom back out a little bit and just say, what does this all have to do with ecology? So we talked a little bit about interactions of getting those animal and insect species back after planting the plants. But when you want to do a project and you say, okay, I'm going to remove all the honeysuckle, is that enough? Is that it? What other interactions, what other pieces do we really have to consider there?
Yeah, I think, as you were talking, I think two things popped into my head, which is one, plants operate on just totally different time scales than people, right? We're focused so much on what's happening this year, next year. But as you said, some of these projects are requiring us to think 5, 10, 50, 100 years into the future. So we're thinking way beyond ourselves, which is really difficult. And oftentimes when you're planting something for something so far in the future, it's harder to develop that connection. You start to see the little wins when the, beautiful birds and butterflies start to show up again year 2, year 3. And those what's, kind of keeps us motivated and keeps us going. But a lot of times we're doing this for something much further in the future. That's when we're really going to see the maximum benefit of the work that we're doing. And I think the other piece is just that this is human driven. We're doing this for ourselves at the end of the day. Not to sound too depressing about things, but if the humans, continue down our path and we do see a lot of loss of these species, eventually the Earth is going to figure itself out, right? Eventually the Earth is going to find a way to reintroduce species and find a way back to biodiversity that it was, within different time periods. So whether that be 100,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now, whatever, Earth is going to continue, but we may not if we don't start to conserve some of these species. There's so many opportunities in every plant, whether it be their chemicals or the food that we can get from them. So as we're trying to think about, how we do this in a way that's successful is just removing the honeysuckle enough. It's not. It's going to be an ongoing project. We mentioned Walnut Woods. That is a restoration project, right next to Walnut Hills High School. And when we started that project, we were like, okay, we can do this for 3, maybe 4 years, and then we can move on to the next site. We'll leave them on their own, and they'll have figured it out. But the more that we're learning is that, if we leave and the effort doesn't have a strong presence, these sites pretty quickly fall back into disrepair. And so it's coming to a point now where, at least within our urban forests, these really small fragmented forests that are usually bordered by roads on all sides and have a lot of urban pressure, whether that be heat, whether that be extreme weather, whether that be invasive plants that continue to get reintroduced, those kinds of spaces are going to need people to continue to foster and restore them and watch out for them well into the future and probably forever. So it's going to require us to take a different approach. And so traditionally, I think we thought of natural spaces, especially in this country as the European settlers were coming through. There was so much natural space, right? There was just so much immense beauty and just such a vastness to the nature that it was pretty overwhelming. And so they thought, we can use these resources forever and we're never going to run out. Well, we've started to hit that point where we're running out. And so these spaces aren't going to be able to sustain themselves without the help of humans. And so now, for better or for worse, humans are going to have to be a part of that process of keeping the invasive plants out and trying to essentially design the space for promoting biodiversity. And we're going to make mistakes. We're going to, like, your previous guest had said from Crew, like, we're just making decisions right now based on what we think is best. But I promise you in 10, 20 years, we're going to look back and say, oh, we could have done so much better if we had done this. But right now, we're definitely continuing to try to make the small impacts that we can so that in the long term, these things are hopefully biodiverse ecosystems. And we know that when there is a big diversity of plants, they foster a big diversity of insects and other wildlife. And that's pretty much what we're operating on right now. that kind of baseline philosophy, and hoping that that is really successful for the long term.
Yeah, yeah. And I see even in our urban setting so many different um, ecosystems. Like when you go to Caldwell, you see so much biodiversity. And Walnut Woods is getting there, but like their spring ephemerals aren't back yet. And so just thinking about the process that goes through. And so I know that when we've talked in the past, you've mentioned, oh, well, we need to pull this weed before this weed, or we need to spray this one first. So I wondered if you could tell us your kind of top 5 best practices for someone that's interested in starting this. We have a lot of people come up to us. A lot of people want to talk about how to fix their properties or just be more sustainable. So what are some of your recommendations for that?
I think step 1 is just in terms of your expectations, expect that it's going to take a while. Don't go into this thinking I can put in 2 years of work and I'm going to be able to step back and it's going to be all great and self-sustaining. It's a process, and I think it's a labor of love, but because it is such a labor of love and takes a long time, you develop such a strong connection to the land in the process. And that connection to the land, I think, is what is going to continue to encourage this work throughout the generations to come. If we feel so strongly about a space, whether that be our own property or that, park down the street, if we have a connection to it, then we're going to bring our friends, we're going to bring our family, we're going to bring our kids there and help them develop that same connection to it. And that's really what's going to help this sustain itself over time. So I think that's step 1, is really start to invest time and develop that connection. Step 2, get involved in an existing project. Don't just go out there and say, oh, I'm going to just start whacking away at stuff and expect to make progress, because a lot of times we do that. We get really frustrated, the plants come back the next year, no progress has been made, and we either burn ourselves out or we are coming to knock on the door of the Civic Garden Center and you're saying, what's going on? Why is this not working? So start with getting involved in some local projects. There's great groups like Cincinnati Parks, the Western Wildlife Corridor, Cardinal Land Conservancy, the Cincinnati Nature Center, are all doing restoration work on their properties. They have a lot of really knowledgeable people that are doing the work. So go learn a little bit from them before you start on your own, because if you don't have a little bit of that, kind of foundation and understanding of what you're getting yourself into, you're probably going to have some, rough experiences that, again, might kind of exhaust you early on. From there, I think it is learning which species to remove first. A lot of times, this is step 3. So I think the third thing is really, if we're removing the honeysuckle because that's the easy one to go after, it's really big, it's really prominent. I know at Walnut Woods we made this mistake where we removed all the honeysuckle because it's easy to do with volunteers. It was so limiting in terms of the access to the space. There was so much honeysuckle you couldn't get people into the site, which made it impossible to really start to use it as a land lab and to get people to experience it. So we removed all the honeysuckle, and this plant called porcelain berry, which is a vine in the grapevine family, just took over. It was kind of hanging out on the edge of the honeysuckle mass, and once that sunlight was opened up from the lack of honeysuckle, that plant has now taken over the whole site, and it is much more difficult to get rid of than the honeysuckle. So make sure you know what species you're removing and have an order of operations. That's why you got to go talk to the experts before you get too far into it. I think from there is definitely help in, kind of getting involved in a community that can help you, right? So if you are trying to tackle this by yourself, again, I think that's where you can start to burn out. So not only are you going to volunteer with Cincinnati Parks to learn from a couple experts, but you're hopefully developing a community of people that, again, not only can you vent to, but maybe you can convince a couple of them to come over and you can cook them some food and you can have them all join you in removing some plants in the backyard. There are companies that do this work. So if you have the means and you have the resources to hire somebody to do it, that's great. But, for those of us who maybe don't have those kinds of resources available, I think trying to develop a community, have some friends that can come over and help you. When you're doing this with a group of people, it's so much easier, it's so much more enjoyable, you just feel better about it. So get some other people involved, and I think you're gonna find much more happiness and success. And then finally is establish native plants. Like once you've done the work, establish native plants, because if we just leave those areas void of plants, once we're done getting all the honeysuckle out of there, something else is going to come back in that gap, and it's probably going to be a non-native invasive plant, because they're really good at colonizing open areas, especially disturbed areas. And so if we don't do the work of reestablishing the native plants, more bad stuff is going to come in, and we're going to be back at square one. So whether that be buying some plants from the Civic Garden Center during one of our sales, whether that be growing your own trees from seed or going to another local nursery, start to find a way to source native plant material and get it back in those spaces. Once the native plants are there, they will hold their own with some help. So, we'll still need to go in there and manage a little bit over time. But if the native plants are there and they're able to really establish themselves in the soil, they're able to especially establish a canopy and throw out some shade, that's going to slow down the invasive kind of onslaught that's coming, and that will help you get it to a point where it's sustainable for you to manage on your own.
Awesome. I love those 5. And just encouragement for everybody who is trying to do this. The soils matter, and it takes a while. So the soils for our native plants were most of them growing in a forest system. And so those soils tend to be a little bit more acidic than other soils. And so really thinking about that longevity, that long-term work, don't get discouraged. Just keep at it. Keep your mentors handy. Keep your community close for going through that. Cool. This has been really good to talk about. Sam and I teach quite a few classes together, and I always learn something new too. My most recent little nugget was we were talking about the Kentucky coffee tree, and thinking about how big these seed pods are. And Sam was telling a group of people, well, it's because the megafauna that were here used to feed on them. And so I just find that you're right, it's contagious. The information keeps getting spread around.
Good way to start is to definitely check with your county resource and county extension agency. A lot of the conservation activities that are happening are at least, maybe in the know by some of our friends at the county. So whether that be, working with the county conservation district, or, like a representative from the Ohio Department of Agriculture, any of those kinds of things. Usually they're aware of some conservation efforts that different organizations are doing and can encourage you to get involved in something that's happening a little bit more local. But there's definitely groups, I would say, everywhere. Even within a lot of the park systems, they have these groups called friends groups, which are tied to different tied to different parks. And so these friends groups go out and just volunteer. Sometimes they're doing invasive removal, sometimes they're doing litter pickup. But I'd say most state parks and even quite a few of your more local parks have these volunteer groups tied to it. And that's really within the Cincinnati park system. What we're relying on are these groups of local volunteers to do the work, because it's just too much space for us to cover otherwise. So we're really tapping into those groups who have a strong affinity to the neighborhood and to preserving their local forest. And some of those groups, you can just find Googling online or talking to some of those local experts.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And as we're talking, I'm thinking this is mostly physical remove, like manual. You're not getting in there with a machine to do this work.
Not on the scale that we're doing. I mean, there are groups out there doing machine level work, but we're doing this, especially in Cincinnati parks. Volunteers can't use machine tools in the parks, so we do everything with hand tools. And so it can be a slow process, but you definitely get a good workout in the process. It's very satisfying to see all the, invasive plants that you've removed in a 2-3 hour workday. So usually it's pretty hands-on, and it can be pretty intensive, but, if you maybe aren't physically able to do some of this work, I would say that's where you can get involved, helping grow some of the plants, or, even just helping some of these organizations do some more research and awareness and getting the word out. There's always a way, I would say, to get involved if you are interested.
And I think the advocacy has really made a difference. I was just at Kroger the other day and saw a bunch of coreopsis, and I was like, oh my gosh, like really, we're doing it. And so that was a really beautiful thing to see. We're seeing these plants become more mainstream. There are lots of opportunities for you to turn even your ornamental front garden into a native space for lots of different pollinator interactions and building up that soil. So
yeah, and I would say too, I mean, if you can get out into a forest that is where some of the work is being done and seeing it firsthand, oftentimes, like you were saying earlier, you don't know what's good or bad until you go out and experience it. And a lot of our trails here in Southwest Ohio are pretty consumed with honeysuckle, so you even feel claustrophobic and unsafe on the trails. And then you walk into a healthy forest and you're like, oh my God, like I love the woods again. Like I feel safe, I feel comfortable. I can see what's going on and see the wildlife. So seek out some of those spaces and know what the good stuff is, so that as you're working on the bad, you know what you're working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I always love the woods at Miami University. Has such open beech maple combinations there. So yeah, I get that.
To the best of your ability, identify what you are working against, because even in your 30 by 60, if this vine like starts to take over and reestablish other roots, suddenly you're just battling that for much longer than you needed to. So you'll just save yourself a little headache and a little bit of time and some physical work as well by following that removal practice and doing the kind of correct order of operations to the best of your ability. I don't think you have to worry too much about it.
And for some of the vines that are crawling on the ground, like poison ivy, which is native, so we like it. Can you sheet mulch over that? Will that kill them? Like if you put several layers of cardboard down and then the soil and then your native plants on top?
I mean, it depends. I would say most of our invasive vines are just really tough. Like you really want to pull out as much of it as you can because they will find a way. Like they'll, might hang out under the ground for a little bit, but they might find a way to poke out. Stuff like porcelainberry has a really robust root system underground. Like you're not just going to hand pull out a big chunk of porcelainberry. And so you're going to be really kind of up against, something that's just without some herbicide or really intentional and consistent kind of suppression. They'll probably fight back for a while.
Okay.
I mean, I'll defend the poison ivy in the sense that, as Mary said, it is native. So, like, especially in the fall, it produces white berries that the birds love and is way more nutrient-packed than honeysuckle, for example. But if it's in your yard, we get it. That's where, working here in this space, it's a public space that we work in with volunteers. So that's where it's like, all right, we need to remove some of the poison ivy. If you have a back area that's wooded and you still can keep it off of like a little trail or something that you're working in, I would say don't go out there and eradicate every single poison ivy plant. But if it's in your yard where you're working all the time, of course you got to get rid of it. And the English ivy is also relentless, unfortunately. But we are doing increasingly more and more classes on different invasive removal techniques. Oftentimes we try to bring in experts who work day in and day out doing this removal on private and public lands. And so we did a winter vine class last year. We'll probably do it again this year. But there's some methods with herbicide and hand pulling that, especially together, can be pretty effective once you start to get it down to a small population.
And then Kayla asked us about our favorite plant for pollinators. I'm going to make you go first.
Oh, it's hard. I think my favorites are always changing. I think my current favorite plant for pollinators is Monarda, bee balm.
That's what I was going to say.
Beat you to it.
I should have gone first.
I think it's just such a beautiful plant, and it's just a lot of fun to watch it grow. So I think it just like kind of has a funky look to it. It smells amazing. We've been cleaning some up that we had left over from last year in the hoop house, and even just like grabbing the foliage and smelling it this time of year, it smells so sweet and amazing.
Yeah, and you can eat it. So we should make some tea.
We should.
That was the plant last fall that was blooming, and my yard is full of little tiny bugs that love to bite you. So like being barefoot in my backyard or sitting on my yard is not enjoyable 2 days later. And I had to sit down and look at this Monarda because it was just crawling and covered with beautiful pollinators. I was like, it's worth it. It's going to be worth all the bumps and itches. And a plant really has not stopped me in my tracks like that in a while. So that was really cool.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our woody shrubs are going to be fair game when it comes to replacing honeysuckle. My personal top two favorites would be pawpaws, which are more of a tree, but they are going to stay relatively, small. They're a kind of mid-story tree, so usually they max out around 20, maybe 25 feet if they're really happy. But they will kind of form a colony, oftentimes stay a little bit shorter. And the other one that I would recommend is spicebush. Spicebush is another native shrub that is the host plant for the spicebush swallowtail butterfly, and won't get quite as dense as honeysuckle. So if you're using it as like a privacy screen, then you might need a couple of them around to really give you that same density. But the reason I like those two plants are the deer don't go after them nearly as much as some of our other native shrubs. So we have things like native viburnums. You even can get some like thicket growing plants like an American plum. Great replacements, but you'll have to do a little more work to keep the deer off of them. Those are really beautiful. But the spicebush and the pawpaw, they tend to be left alone unless the deer get really, really desperate. So especially in our forests, we're seeing spicebush and pawpaw coming back as the predominant understory in places where we have removed honeysuckle because the deer tend to leave them alone. They go after so many other species. They're kind of managing the forest in a way that's a little different than we would expect otherwise.
What about ninebark?
Ninebark's another good one. That's a great one, especially if you have a little more sun. I would say the ninebark. They probably won't do dense shade. They will do like part shade on the edge of a forest or like on the edge of like a shade canopy from a tree, even if it's a single tree. But ninebark's gorgeous and a great one as well.
I think that wraps up our bistro for today. Sam, thank you so much for taking time out. I know you had a busy morning with volunteers, potting up lots of native plants to get ready for our fall event. And thank you so much to all of you who have been along for the ride, and I can't wait to come back with a whole new series for you in the fall. Bye.
Awesome. See you, everyone.